Okay, so we have war in Europe. So at this point, where we at? At this point, we have we have all the pieces set. You have the Axis powers, you have Japan, you have Italy, you have Japan, Germany, and then you have the Allied powers that are formulated at this point. Because after the German invasion of Russia, you have the Americans. After Pearl Harbor, you have the English, and then you have the Russians, and then you also have a small French force, and the French will come around and 100% join the Allies by the end of the war. But at this point, France really doesn't exist. You have half of Germany controls half of France, and then you have what we refer to as Vichy France, or Vichy France, which is a German puppet government that's running France and its colonies worldwide. And so from 1939 until really 1942, the Axis powers are pretty well unstoppable. Germany's conquered basically all of Europe. Japan, after Pearl Harbor, takes huge amounts of the Pacific. Italy's just kind of along for the ride at this point, but they're there. German U-boats are very successful in the Atlantic Ocean. They sink somewhere between 3 to 4 ships a day. And the German forces by December 7th, 1941, have pushed all the way into the outskirts of Moscow. And if there's one date in World War II that is the turning point, it's going to be December 7th, 1941, because that's going to bring America into the war. And it's also going to change the focus of, if I can have a map of Russia here. This is as far as the German advance gets. And after December 7th, 1941, you're going to have a huge change, because Moscow is somewhere here on this outer edge. And the Russians have this, it would be off to the side, all the way over here, if you can follow my hand, have a huge army in Eastern Russia, protecting its eastern border from Japan. But after December 7th, 1941, Russia is able to take that army, or the majority of that army, and send them to what would be the Western theater for Russia. Because they're not going to have to worry about the Japanese attacking Russian holdings, because the Japanese aren't going to take on America and Russia at the same time in a full-scale war. And so after December 7th, 1941, you have a huge shift in the war, because Russia is able to counterattack the Germans using those forces that were in Eastern Russia, and now are on Western Russia. And so the Russian front is going to begin to swing to the advantage of the Russians. You're also going to have the Russian winter of 1941 that's going to change the way. Well, the Germans aren't prepared for the winter, and so it's going to change the way the war is fought, and it's going to swing things towards the advantage of the Russians. At the same time, the Americans, after December 7th, 1941, are able to fully focus their resources and all the might of the American war effort to aid the Allies. And so we don't have this situation where we have to come up with like Lend-Lease acts or whatever. It's just, hey, if the British need something, we're going to send it to them. If the Russians need something, we're going to figure out a way to get it to them. The Americans don't have to tiptoe around diplomacy or whatever. We're in the war, and so now it's just time to get things going where they go. And so here's our map. Early 1942, you have everything in red is run by the Russians. Everything in red is owned by controlled by the Germans. Spain is neutral, Portugal is neutral, Great Britain is hanging on, Sweden is neutral, and so we have that. Okay. And so when the Allies get together, or at least when Churchill and Roosevelt get together, and so I think one of the things that happens during the Second World War is we kind of just lump everybody together, like the Allies. It's America, it's Germany, or America and Russia and Great Britain. But Russia is really kind of on its own. I mean, it's kind of off to the side. And yes, America sends Russia supplies and money and whatever, but the Russians are going to take the majority of the blunt of the German military might throughout the war. And so, the Allies are going to agree on this European first policy in which the Americans at least are going to focus the majority of our efforts on Europe. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that America is not going to focus on the Pacific, because we will. But, it's going to be more of a probably 70-30, maybe an 80-20 split. Some historians will say it's 50-50, and I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think we spend the majority of our effort goes to Europe. Okay. And there's lots of reasons for this decision. First of all, in the Pacific, our allies in the Pacific, aren't major. Unfortunately, they're not major allies, and so China is an ally to the Americans, but like it's not England, or it's not. We don't have that cultural connection, and so there's going to be a bigger push to control Europe. Also, I think it's kind of agreed that Hitler and this idea of fascism in Europe is probably a greater world evil than the rise of militarism in Japan. The United States feels like if it puts the war effort against the Japanese, it's going to be successful. But the outcome of the war in Europe, even after America enters the war, is in doubt. And so, in 1942, the main problem again is going to be Europe, and that's going to be our focus. So in 1942 is this big swing year because, the German invasion of the Soviet Union had been really successful. They pushed to the edge of Moscow, and there's talk of the Russian government abandoning Moscow and moving over the mountain range, the Ural Mountains, and reestablishing a capital there. And Stalin holds on, and then all of a sudden Japan attacks America, and Russia is able to reinforce its troops outside of Moscow. And the Soviet Union is going to launch a winter counteroffensive, which is going to be called Operation Uranus, or if you're in fifth grade, it's called Operation Uranus. And this is going to, start to push back the German advance. The Germans aren't prepared for the cold Russian winter. They're not prepared for the amount of resources the Russians are going to throw at them. And the supply lines are horribly long. I mean, like if you're looking from Berlin to Moscow, that's thousands and thousands of miles versus any place else in the war where you don't have those problems. The Russians are the Germans are going to besiege major cities in Russia. One of them is going to be the siege of Leningrad, which really at this point doesn't have a whole lot of military importance. But from 1941 to January of 1944, the Germans aren't going to allow any food or anything to come into Leningrad, and they're going to starve out a huge number of people. So 600,000 people, Russian civilians, are going to die during this siege. And so some historians will look at this. Look at how in St. Petersburg or Leningrad is going to be up in here. We're going to look at these efforts that are put in the Second World War and claim that the war is ultimately going to be won with two things. The first one is going to be American technology. The ability of the Americans to put more fighting materials into the front is going to overwhelm the Germans. And then the second one is just going to be the human cost that the Russians are going to pay for the Second World War. And so you'll hear that the Second World War is won with Russian blood and American technology, because the Russians are going to lose close to 20 million people, civilians and soldiers combined, in the fighting of the Second World War. and that is that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a big number. It's a big number. So, anyways, the Germans have occupied the Balkans. They've conquered Greece. It's really important that the Allies try to figure out a way to stop this, because if you get into the Middle East and into the Russian oil fields, then those are a lot of natural resources that the Germans are going to have at their disposal. This is about the time, 1942, that the Germans begin to enslave large numbers of captured populations and begin their enslaved work camps. The Germans are going to have various levels of different types of camps. You'll have concentration camps that we're all familiar with, and we kind of lump all these camps together. So you'll have concentration camps, but those are more of a political holding area. You'll have the Jewish death camps, in which or the extermination camps, in which the Germans look to kill large numbers of people from the Jewish population, or from populations that they believed were undesirable. So, like the mentally handicapped, the physically handicapped, homosexuals, political opponents, so like communists, Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted during this point as well. But you have hold on just one second here. Sorry, I had to kill a moth, and that means we only have like 14 million more moths to kill. But anyways, you're going to see resistance movements pop up in areas of German occupation. And so, like, while some of the populations of these areas are being forced into work camps or to produce war goods for the Nazis, you're going to have resistance in almost every area. You're going to have the French resistance, you're going to have the Dutch resistance, you're going to have the Polish resistance, that are going to look to sabotage and harass the Germans, assassinate high-ranking military officials, and we go there. Almost immediately after America enters the war, the Russians are going to ask the Americans and the British to open up a Western front in Europe, to invade France, to liberate France in some way, because of the strain that this war is putting on the Russian people. And so in 1942, the Allies don't really think that they have the strength to do this. They're absolutely probably 100% right, because when we look at the Allied invasion, or at least the American invasion of North Africa, there's going to be lots of problems. And so, like, if the Americans would have tried to, let's say, attack the Atlantic Wall like we do on D-Day of June 6, 1944, if we would have tried to do that in 1942, we would have been horribly unsuccessful, and things would have been bad. And so the Allies don't feel that we have the strength to take on the heart of the German army in Europe at this point, and so we focus on North Africa to begin with. The Germans have taken over large quantities of this land, so all the way from Morocco, Algeria, Libya, into Egypt, and they keep pushing and pushing the British back. And the British are very concerned that they're going to lose their control of the Suez Canal, and if the British lose control of the Suez Canal, then they're probably going to lose access to their colonies in Asia, so India, those types of places that are sending resources back to England. And so if you do that, then England is in really, really, really big trouble. The German forces in North Africa are led by Erwin Rommel. He's a German general. One of the interesting things about Rommel, and probably one of the interesting things about the German military in general, is the fact that that Rommel is not a Nazi. Like, he actually gets involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler and has to take his own life, kills himself, versus going through a public trial and bringing shame to his family. And that's going to happen sometime in 1944, I believe. But before that, Rommel is wonderfully successful in the desert with the German Panzer divisions, the tank divisions, the desert forces, and he's almost unstoppable. He's going to defeat the British at almost every turn. And that is until the Battle of El Alamein, which is in Egypt. And Rommel and a British commander by the name of Montgomery clash in El Alamein, and the British are able to concentrate forces there, and they're victorious. And about the same time, the Americans have landed in Morocco and have begun their expansion west over Africa. And so the Americans are going to land in Morocco. And we actually run into, ironically, we run into French resistance in places like Algeria because of Vichy France, this puppet government of the French, had kept the colonial French forces in place, and basically under the threat that if they don't fight the Americans or they don't fight Allied forces, then the rest of France would fall under the control of the Nazis, or there would be repercussions brought out against their families. And so Eisenhower, who was put in charge of this invasion of Africa, really has to work some political strings to get the French to basically surrender and switch sides. And so the Americans run into some problems fighting the French, who are not they're not necessarily a very motivated fighting force early on, but they're motivated enough that, and the Americans are green enough to combat in 1942 that it causes the Americans some problems. And so within about a month, the Americans kind of figure this out. We kind of figure out desert warfare, and we start to advance on German holdings throughout North Africa. Montgomery and his forces are victorious at El Alamein, and they begin to push westward. The Americans are pushing eastward, and the Germans and the Italians are caught in the middle. And so I'm assuming that you guys aren't that far removed from high school and puberty, and so like when you get a pimple on your face on both sides of it, you understand what happens. And really the same thing is going to happen here to the German forces in North Africa. They're going to have pressure from the east and pressure from the west, and the forces are going to pop. It's going to be too much for them. Rommel will actually leave Africa before the end, and the German forces and the Italian forces that were fighting for Africa will fall to the Allied forces in 1942. Okay. And so the Allies are going to be victorious in El Alamein, and that's a huge turning point because that's the first military victory for the British. The Americans show up and we're victorious in Western Africa as well. And so while that is going on, we're going to have the Battle of Stalingrad that's going to take place. And so the Battle of Stalingrad is of huge significance in the eastern, in the Russian frontier, the Russian campaign, because Stalingrad was not necessarily a huge of huge military importance, but it's of huge symbolism, I suppose. Stalin is the leader of Russia, and here's the city of his birth. It's named after him after he took control of Russia, and the Germans want to control it. If the Germans take Stalingrad, then there's really no resistance between them and the oil fields of the Caucasus of Russia, and so the Germans would then have almost unlimited oil at that point to fund their war machine. And so we fight the Battle of Stalingrad. It's probably one of the more horrific battles of World War II. It happens in the winter of 1941, 1942. And the Russians just refuse to give up the city. They don't allow any of the civilians to leave, which makes the fighting even worse because you have civilian casualties, and it puts pressure on the Germans from outside sources, which the Germans necessarily don't care about. The Germans invade the city, but then as they invade the city, the Russians blow up buildings, and the Germans bomb the city, trying to gain control. And so you have this whole city that's in ruins, which creates this battlefield, an urban battlefield, in which these people are fighting street to street, or room to room, or block to block, and it's pretty awful. If you ever get the opportunity to watch the movie Enemy at the Gates, it's about the Battle of Stalingrad. It's told through the eyes of two snipers. It's a fictional sniper battle, but it gives you a good overview of what that city must have been like, and the fighting that would have been going on in there. So, anyways, the Germans get bogged down. The Russian winter in November of 1942 allows for the freezing of the river that is on the eastern side of Stalingrad. It allows the Russian army to encircle the German forces inside of Stalingrad, and so the Germans at once had a siege of the city of Stalingrad, and then the Russians are able to encircle that siege, and so now the Germans are trapped in their siege, and there's no way out. And eventually, in February of 1943, the Germans are going to surrender, and they're going to lose about a little over 1 million troops to death and surrender. And it's the first time the Germans have ever lost an entire field army. And it's going to weaken their efforts in the Russian theater to the point that they're never going to be able to launch an offensive again. Okay, so that's the overall importance of Stalingrad. Some of the fun things about Stalingrad, I don't know if there's any fun things about Stalingrad, but one of the things the Russians would do during this time frame is they would strap explosives onto dogs. And then they would train the dogs basically to go lay under German tanks, and then they would detonate the explosives. And so that's one way that they would attack the tanks. And you can watch a brief video of that. Oh, I know. That's it all. So I mean, it's hard. It would be hard to shoot a dog, right? Like, and then after they were successful so many times, the Germans just started to kill every dog that they saw, because it was part of war at that point. North Africa, we talked about that. Dwight Eisenhower leads the Americans and the British in Morocco and Algeria, and we push eastward and we trap them, right? And so this victory in Africa is huge because it opens up Europe. And then the question begins, all right, where are the Allies going to strike next? And of course, Stalin is still pushing for the invasion of France. And the Allies are uncertain, especially Churchill. Churchill's very reluctant to ever commit to the invasion of France. In fact, D-Day is basically kind of planned in the objection of with the objection of the British, and the British are nervous because if they lose, I mean, they have a lot to. If the invasion is unsuccessful, they have a lot to lose with a invasion of France, and then maybe a counterattack of the British Isles, and so they don't like that. And so in 1943, early 1943, we've been successful in North Africa. The Russians have stopped the German advance on the Russian front, and we're starting to try to figure out how we're going to finish up this war. While that's going on in the Pacific, the Japanese are extremely successful in early 1942. Probably the first 6 months of 1942, the Japanese capture more land than anybody ever would have expected. The Japanese attack of the Philippines begins in January of 1942, and by May of 1942, we have about, I don't know, 12,000 Americans and about 70,000 Filipino troops that were trapped on a peninsula inside on the island of the Philippines. And eventually they're going to surrender. They run out, they fight for 5 or 6 months. They run out of food, they run out of ammunition, and we run into these problems. And so the Americans surrender. They fight until they can't fight anymore. And this is the first time that the Japanese have had a large scale American force surrender. And this is the first time that we've learned about the Japanese and their feelings about surrender. And the Japanese, kind of look at soldiers that surrender as subhuman. And so they treat our prisoners this way. Like there's 70,000 people, or a little over 70,000 people, that are going to be led on this 65-mile march through the jungles in the Philippines. And like, you're like, 65 miles, that's not that bad. But you've been fighting for the past 6 months, and you're malnourished, and you don't have food and water. And so 65 miles is a long way. And so over that, about 1 out of every 7, about 10,000 men are killed by the Japanese in this death march. So this gets nicknamed the Bataan Death March. And when the American public finds out, they're even further infuriated with the Japanese during this time frame. And so the Americans are going to have a huge influx in volunteers. So after Pearl Harbor, you have a large number of people that volunteer to fight, and then after the Bataan Death March becomes public knowledge, you have even more people show up. And so as far as like fighting in the Pacific, it's probably the most intense of all the combat that the Americans are going to see during the Second World War, just because of the hatred on both sides. The Japanese are pretty fierce, no quarter kind of soldiers that when they fight, and the Americans, obviously you have Pearl Harbor, you have the Bataan Death March. You have some of the atrocities that the Japanese will commit against soldiers, and so like there's not a lot of love lost between the Japanese and the Americans during this time frame. And so we have that. The Japanese have taken over about 300,000 square miles of the Pacific. And just to kind of give you an idea of a map of what that looks like. No, I don't. I wish I did. Basically from Japan all the way to the coast of Australia. I mean, they're right off the coast of Australia. By the summer of 1942. And, the Japanese are threatening an invasion of Australia, which it would have been interesting because the Japanese don't have enough soldiers to contain, to fight in Australia, let alone to conquer it. But, just the threat is a problem. Also, the Japanese during this time frame in early 1942 have more ships in the ocean than the Americans. The majority of the American fleet is damaged during Pearl Harbor, and we have not replaced it by that point. And so in mid 1942, like I said, May 1942, we're going to see the turning points of the war in the Pacific. The first one is going to be the Battle of Coral Sea. And this is what's going to save Australia, basically. There's in northeastern Australia, you have the Coral Sea that sets off of the coast. And the Japanese and the American Army, the Japanese and the American Navy are going to fight a huge naval battle off the coast of Australia, and it's going to end in a tie. But it's costly enough for the Japanese that they give up their threatening posture against Australia, I suppose. Interesting thing about Coral Sea, this is the first time that planes from each side, actually, the ships from each side in a naval battle don't actually see each other. And so like you have fighter planes that are going to fight, you have bomber planes that are going to attack each other's navy, you have artillery shells that are going to be fired back and forth. In the Battle of Coral Sea in 1942 is the first time that we have a naval battle in which ships don't actually see each other. And then the second major turning point is going to happen in June of 1942, and that's going to be the Battle of Midway. Anybody seen the movie Midway with the Jonas brother?
No.
Nobody? No? You guys are
Is
missing out.
it with his wife in it too?
I couldn't tell you. I just know that he was in it. I thought it was pretty good.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, it was decent. Anyways, the Battle of Midway is interesting because we had talked about the fact that the Americans had decoded the Japanese communications, and so they realized that a attack on Midway was going to happen. And so the Americans are able to take their remaining naval fleet and kind of hide it in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Midway. And when the Japanese fleet shows up to attack Midway, which was a naval base, it had a airfield. It had a lot of major things that the Japanese would want. The American Navy is there unbeknownst to the Japanese. And so what ensues is probably the most important naval battle of World War II, in which the Americans sink four of the five Japanese aircraft carriers that are with this Japanese fleet. And it all happens within like 15-20 minutes. Now we were listening to communications, but just because you know the communications doesn't necessarily mean that you know exactly where the ships are going to be. It was kind of just a freak luck that they have this, and the Americans are able to discover the aircraft carriers and to sink all five or four of the five very, very quickly. And so with those with this major victory, that the Americans now are going to hold the upper hand in the Pacific, and we're going to begin not only just kind of trying to defend American islands or American holdings or Allied holdings, we're going to start to advance on Japanese positions. So we're going to start to attack the Japanese. And so the method that we're going to use is something called island hopping. It's pretty simple. If you think of the Pacific, it's just this big series of islands all over, and the Japanese are going to come in and they're going to take over every island. Well, the Americans don't necessarily need to retake every single island. What we can do is we could retake the key islands that would allow us to control shipping lanes, and then not allow those islands to be reinforced. And so that's basically all we're doing. The first island that we're going to take is in the Solomon Islands. It's called Guadalcanal. It's off the coast of Australia. It's northeast of Australia. In August of 1942, we're going to have about 20,000 Americans that are Marines that are going to land on the island. And if you think about, like, I'm assuming that most people here have probably seen Saving Private Ryan and the D-Day scene when they roll into Omaha Beach and all the fighting that happens on the beach. The Pacific is a little bit different because the Japanese typically don't defend beach landings or attack beach landings. What they will do is they will set back into a defensive position somewhere in the jungle and allow the Americans to come to them. And so in August of 1942, the Americans get off landing craft in Guadalcanal, and they don't find the Japanese. It's like the whole Japanese are missing. And so that night, there's a huge naval fight, and the Japanese are victorious in that. And so these 20,000 Americans that are on Guadalcanal are just trapped. And for the next 4 months, they're basically going to march into the islands and the jungles of Guadalcanal and going to engage the Japanese forces there. And in February of 1943, they're going to be victorious, and the Marines are going to win the first battle of win the battle of Guadalcanal. And so that kind of gets us through Europe and the Pacific, at least in early 1942, 1943. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. And so then let's talk about the war effort at home. It's going to be very similar to what we saw during the First World War, except for the fact that America is going to be in World War II for a much longer period of time. And because we're going to be there for a much longer period of time, we're going to see a much greater impact on the American life. Before Pearl Harbor, America has a relatively small military. We have 1.5 million. By the end of the war, we're going to have at least 12 million Americans that served in World War II. I'm sorry, 12 million people are in uniform, and 15 million had served at one point or another. Almost every family will lose somebody, or I'm sorry, every family is going to have somebody that serves during the Second World War, and most people are going to know someone that personally dies in the war. When we get to Vietnam, obviously it's a much smaller war effort, and you're not going to have every family is not going to have someone that's going to serve during Nam. And every family will know of someone that probably passes away or dies during the fighting. But in World War II, every family is going to be affected to the point that they're probably going to know somebody personally that is going to die. The average military age of World War II veteran during that time frame is 26. Again, Vietnam and World War II are the two that get compared a lot. The average age of the veteran of Vietnam is going to be 18 or 19. And so you have that. Women are going to play a huge role in the war. It's going to be different than World War II. World War I. World War I, women are going to come into the fighting community, or to the war community. They're going to serve as like operators and nurses and whatever. In World War II, women are going to take on almost every aspect of military service outside of combat. Each branch of the military is going to have some sort of an auxiliary unit for women. We're going to have the WAC, which is the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. You're going to have the WAVE, which is the Navy. You're going to have the WASP, which is the Army. And women are going to serve in all kinds of roles. Anything that you can think of that's non-combat. We have radio operators, mechanics, and pilots, and all of those things. Women are going to serve as test pilots in America during this time frame. The war itself, the war effort itself, is going to bring an end to the Depression, or bring the recovery full scale, to the point that GDP from 1939 is going to double by 1945, and by 1944, unemployment is basically non-existent. Most places can't find enough help to fill all the jobs they need. Industry is going to look to hire new workers, and so like deaf people are going to be hired to work around very loud machines. Little people are going to be hired to inspect the inside of airplane wings. Women are going to be hired in larger numbers than ever before to fill in for men that are leaving for the efforts. African Americans are going to see an increase in hiring practices during this time frame, and so it's kind of an all hands on deck situation. The government again is going to regulate the war effort. We're going to have war production boards in which we're going to organize production, and we're going to regulate raw materials. From 1942 to really 1945, it's very difficult to find a non-military vehicle because most of the car factories during this time frame are used to build airplanes and tanks. Pantyhose or nylon hoses fall out of favor because they start to be used for like parachutes. Okay, and so you have that. Factories in Michigan. Here we go. To give you an idea of the output of the American war effort. In Michigan, we're rolling a new B-24 bomber off of the lines every hour. And so for every day you're putting 24 new planes in just from one factory in Michigan. Not to talk about what's happening in Seattle or Wichita or other places. And so the Americans are just going to flood the battlefield with military goods. There's a saying from a German tank commander, a Panzer commander, that a Panzer in the battlefield is worth 10 Sherman tanks. And he said that in the second half of the quote is, the problem is the Americans always have 11. And so, like, the Americans, our stuff might not be as good as some of the products the Germans were producing during this time frame, but we have more of it. The other thing that comes about that we start to see during the war effort is the fact that if you have a product that is too technologically advanced, specifically like tanks, like the Panzer tanks that the Germans used, if they broke down in battle, it was very unlikely that that the Germans themselves could fix them. And they would have to send them back to like factories or to repair centers where technicians could work on things, versus like the American Sherman tanks were basically kind of like an iron tractor. And so like the mechanics of the Sherman are very similar to some of the tractors that the farmers back home would, the soldiers that were used to be farmers were used to. And so like if they would break down, the Americans could fix them in the field more readily than the Germans could at that point. The government's going to give large government contracts to the major industrial players of the day. So people like General Motors and Ford and Chrysler are going to be giving government contracts in a disproportional rate than smaller companies. Mostly because, this was a situation where if a company would fail to deliver on what was promised, then the government wouldn't be able to carry out the war effort. And so you're going to give your most important contracts to the people you trust the most. And so we go from there. Just like, here we go. So just like in World War I, we're going to see tax increases. About half of the war is going to be paid for with tax increases, about 40%. And then the other 60% is going to be financed by the American people through the purchase of war bonds. And so a war bond is basically just a promise that the government is going to pay you back with some sort of money. So you give the government $100, and then 10 years they'll give you $110 or something along those lines. And you're going to see a huge wave of propaganda that's going to come about during this time frame. Here we go, buy war bonds. You have Uncle Sam, and he's got this whole bag full of war. Or Superman and Batman and Robin, they're going to sell war bonds. Sink the Japanese with bonds and stamps, and so you're going to buy those. Buy a crop that never fails. If you you use your money and you buy war bonds, you're going to make money on it. Here we go. It's a little bit more aggressive. If you give us the fire, we'll give them the hell. And so, again, you're just encouraging Americans to fund the war effort. Just like in World War I, you guys did, I believe you guys did a thing about rationing. So the government's going to ration goods. They're going to set prices. Each family is going to get a ration book that's going to look something similar to this. And inside, you're going to have these stamps. And each stamp is going to represent a good that's being rationed. And it might be wheat, it might be bread, it might be gas or meat or something along those lines. And Americans are going to be encouraged to follow through with this rationing program. They're not going to use more stuff than they need, and if they buy more stuff, they're not going to sell it for profits, right? We're also going to ask Americans to plant gardens at home and do those types of things. We kind of talked about women and minorities finding jobs. You're going to see this idea of Rosie the Riveter. That's going to, American women are going to come out and fill in for the men that are left behind, do the job that he left behind. Here we go. So women are asked to do that. Women are going to take all kinds of jobs. They're kind of told to think of their job as temporary. This is going to be a job until the war effort is over. Most women during this time frame are going to struggle to find childcare. That's really going to be the biggest issue in America during that time frame is finding people to take care of kids or young children, so moms could go and work in the war industry. Roosevelt is going to desegregate the war effort or the war industry. He's not going to give government contracts to companies that discriminate against African Americans or other racial minorities during this time frame. And that's where we're are. You guys good if we just keep going?
I don't
Okay.
mind. This is like, for me, it was fascinating. Those videos were something else.
Okay. Okay, so we'll just keep trucking on. So 1943, the Americans and the Allies kind of have a hold in Europe and in Asia. We don't have well, at least we've stopped the bleeding. Let's just say there, like we have the Germans and the Italians contained at this point. And so the advances have stopped, and now we're going to focus on liberating different areas. The first thing that we have to do is we have to gain control of the Atlantic. The Germans in 1942 had sank like 900 ships with their submarines. And then by 1943, 1944, the use of technology like sonar and the American transports that would zigzag across the ocean, being escorted by destroyers, had destroyed a large number of German submarines. And then at that point, the heat, I suppose, that the Americans were bringing in the shipment of goods was more of a price than the Germans wanted to pay. And so by 1943, the Allies are basically moving supplies pretty well unharassed across the Atlantic. Does that mean every boat gets across? No, but the vast majority do. You guys watched the movie, hopefully, about the bombing in Germany. And so by 1943, the Americans had begun to gain air superiority in Europe. The Americans and the British, the combined bombing efforts on major German cities have really started to limit the number of airplanes and bomber planes the Germans could produce. So by 43, for every bomber plane that gets shot down with the Americans, you're going to have 24 to replace it from that day coming out of Michigan. In Germany, that's not the case. And so for every plane that gets shot down in Germany, that's one less plane that they're going to have. And so the German war machine is really kind of starting to crumble. In January of 43, Roosevelt and Churchill agree that they're going to in January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill, they meet in Casablanca, Morocco, and they agree that they're going to fight unconditional surrender, that there's not going to be a situation in which the Allies are going to sign. First of all, they're not going to sign individual peace deals like we did in World War I. If we're going to end the war, America, England, England and Russia are going to do it together. And then number two, that there's not going to be conditions placed on the Allied victory, that there's not going to be a situation in which the Allies are going to stop fighting and allow the fascists to maintain control in any way, shape, or form. In 43, Roosevelt wants to launch some kind of an invasion of France, and Churchill is against it. And so Churchill basically argues that we should focus on Italy, specifically Sicily, and then into the boot of Italy, and that's the first European front that's opened up by the British and the Americans. In July of 1943, we launched the assault on Sicily, which I mean, to be honest, it's wildly successful for the Americans. There's still harsh fighting, but like the Americans are able to take Sicily very quickly, and then we move into the mainland of in the mainland of Italy. And once the Allies hit the coast of Italy, almost instantaneously Mussolini's government falls apart, and so Mussolini's step is thrown out. He's actually captured and held prisoner. The new Italian government surrenders to the Allies, and Hitler's faced with this choice in the 40s and in 43, if he's going to surrender all of Italy or if he's going to take forces out of the Western campaign and the Russian campaign and bring them to Italy to try to slow the Allied advance. And ultimately, that's what he's going to do. He's going to take German forces. Oh, sorry, goodness gracious. He's going to take German forces and bring them into Italy to try to slow down the Allies. Where are we at? This is ultimately successful for the Germans in the fact that the Allies never fully take control of Italy during the war. It's not until the Germans capitulate from the war that fighting in Italy actually ends. However, it does take a little bit of strain off of the Russians. The Allies advance slowly and steadily up the Italian peninsula. By June of 1944, the Allies recaptured Rome. And the majority of fighting that's going to take place there is going to, in Italy at this point, is going to be in the northern mountains. And so the Russians are not happy with the Allied war effort, and we're pushing for more. So up until this point, up until late 1943, so we're looking November, December 1943, the three major leaders of the Allies have not met in person. Stalin had always claimed that he couldn't leave Russia while there was fighting going on in Russia. To move Roosevelt from place to place was pretty logistically difficult because of his handicap, and Churchill and Stalin just don't like each other. And so Churchill and Roosevelt met in early 1943, in January 1943 in Casablanca. And then it's arranged that in neutral territory in 1943 that the three major leaders would meet in Tehran, Iran. And so they get together. There's actually an assassination attempt there's a planned assassination by the Germans to try to kill all three of these guys. And so because of that, Roosevelt doesn't stay at the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. He actually stays at the Soviet embassy because the Soviet embassy and the British embassy are right next to each other. And so it's easier for security teams to kind of control everything. And so with that, Roosevelt goes on this huge, like, I'm going to call it gaslighting campaign, I suppose, to win over the support of the Russians, because Roosevelt realizes that if he's in the Russian embassy, that everything he says is going to be bugged, it's going to be heard and recorded. And so he goes to great pains to make sure that everything that comes out of his mouth or any of his aides' mouth is pro-Russian, is in support of Stalin. And he uses this as a great propaganda friendship making moment in which he goes there and kind of wins over the Russians for the Allied movements. So we have that. In June of 1944, it's agreed that the invasion of France would be planned. It was actually, March through July is when the original idea was put in place. It's codenamed Operation Overlord, and it's given. The command of this is given to Dwight David Eisenhower. By this point, in early 1944, we start to see a huge buildup of U.S. troops in England. And the Germans aren't dumb. They realize an invasion is going to come at some point. The question is really just where. Is it going to come probably from the Normandy beaches where it ultimately does, or is there a northern attack route through northern France and Belgium. And so then the Allies have some choices to make, and they ultimately settle on the Normandy beaches. But they're also given this weird opportunity. Probably America's greatest fighting general during the Second World War is George Patton. And Patton is he's nicknamed Old Blood and Guts, and like he's something else. Like he doesn't believe in cowardice, and he really kind of believes that the idea, he has a famous speech that it's not your job as a soldier to die for your country, it's your job to make somebody else, the other guy, die for his. But at the same time, like he just pushes and pushes and pushes soldiers. And so during the Italian campaign, Patton is leading some troops, and afterwards he goes into a military hospital, and he's handing out Purple Hearts, and he's trying to raise some morale of some of the soldiers. And he sees a guy that's like cowered in the corner, and he's crying and sniffling and whatever. And Patton is like, "Hey, what happened to you, son?" And the guy's like, "I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore." He's suffering from battle fatigue, or we would call it PTSD today. And Patton is like, "Oh, I'll tell you what you're suffering from. You're just a coward." And so Patton starts to physically assault him, like slap him and kick him. And there's media cameras there, and they film it. And this starts to get back to the American public that, here you have this, I believe he's a 3-star general at the time, or a 2-star general at the time, beating up a private in the American army. And so for the Germans or the Italians, this is no big deal. Like, hey, this is just leadership. But for the American military and the importance that we put on individuals, this is a huge violation of protocol. And so Patton is stripped of his command. And he's put in England, in northern England, and the Allies use him as kind of they build him a phony army. They give him a small command. They have these soldiers walk around. They're not very secretive. They build plywood tanks or jeeps, or blow up tanks and jeeps, and they position them different places, and they allow for the German surveillance, the Germans to see this and report back. And so the Germans are convinced that the main invasion force is going to be led by Patton, because why would the Americans take their best general and remove him from the game right before the biggest play? And so even after the D-Day invasion happens in Normandy, the response units of the Germans don't respond as quickly as they probably should have, because they were waiting for Patton and this Patton's pretend army to invade across the northern part of the English Channel. All right, so June 6, 1944, the Allied troops are going to invade the Normandy beaches. This is the largest amphibious assault in the history of humankind. It's also the largest use of airborne troops. If you guys have seen Saving Private Ryan, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to watch it. It's a wonderful movie, even though there's some historical inaccuracies. But the first 25-30 minutes of the Normandy, Utah, I think it's Omaha Beach, is pretty wonderful and accurate. And so these allies, the Allies would use paratroopers to jump behind enemy lines into France, and they have these clickers, and I have one at my desk drawer that I purchased at some point. That I'll bring out. It's just this dog clicker, or it's a kid's toy that just click, 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 click. And so the paratroopers jump into France, and when they do that, they just get scattered all over. And so they each have, an idea of what they're supposed to do, but with their unit, but like obviously their units are all blown all over. And so they use these clickers to like regroup with other Americans or other British. They'll just click, and then they'll wait to hear this somewhere else, and they try to gather together and figure out what their missions were and what they should do, and so they do that. The Allied invasion of Normandy is actually 5 beaches. You have the American beaches, which are Utah and Omaha. You have the British and Canadian and French forces in Juno, Sword, and Gold. those 5 beaches, the Americans are the 2 beaches the Americans take. We like to say are the hardest. They probably are. And Utah is by far the hardest of the 5 because the tanks that were supposed to go in and take out some of the Atlantic seawall, they get dropped off too far from the coast and they sink to the bottom. And so the soldiers that go up the beaches at Omaha Beach don't have support from the tanks. And so the naval ships that are the naval transports actually act kind of as with their artillery shells. They act as they act to take out some of the defenses that were supposed to be knocked out by the tanks. Okay, so by the evening of June 6th, about 10,000 Allied troops are on mainland Europe, and the invasion has begun. There's going to be a lot more fighting that's going to take place, but you know, at least we have the first stepping stones towards the defeat of the Nazis in Europe during this time frame. So by July, you're going to have over 1 million troops, and that will be our and that will be basically the end, the beginning of the end for the Germans there. By August, we'd freed Paris. In September, the Americans and the Canadians and the British are pushing on the outskirts of the German border. We've taken over Brussels and in Belgium, and then in winter. And of course, in the winter of 1944, we're going to have a major German counteroffensive, which is called the Battle of the Bulge, in which the Germans try to break through Allied lines along the Ardennes forest, and the Allies are forced to retreat, but never. But the lines never. The Germans never achieve a breakthrough, and so while the Battle of the Bulge is the costliest fighting in World War II for the Americans, ultimately it's successful because the Americans hold off the British. The 101st Airborne gains a huge amount of notoriety from the Battle of the Bulge. They drop into a town called Bastogne, France, which was a major road. It controlled bridges over major rivers, and the Germans had encircled them, and they hold out for a long period of time until reinforcements arrive to save them. Those reinforcements are led by George Patton, who, after the Battle of Normandy, is re-given the command, and he and his armored troops come and rescue the 101st in Bastogne. So we have that. In February of 1945, the war is basically over. Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill, they meet in Yalta to kind of talk about how the war is going to look at the end. And if you look here, if you compare this to the first meeting, Roosevelt looks pretty good here, right? Late 1943. By 1945, Roosevelt's health is failing, and we have that. So Yalta, it's agreed that we're going to have the United Nations. We're going to have a international peacekeeping body. It's agreed that the Soviets would declare war on Japan within 3 months of the German surrender. That the Soviets are going to be given Japanese islands in concession for entering the war. That Germany is going to be divided up into 4 military sections. Each of the allies is going to get a section of Germany after the war, and that governments are going to be allowed to be created on democratic elements. And so that's in February. You guys watched the video. We talked about the firebombing of Dresden. And then in April of 1945, Roosevelt dies of a stroke. And so Roosevelt passes away. Harry Truman inherits the presidency, and he's going to oversee the end of the war. In April of 25, the Americans and the Germans meet, or I'm sorry, the Americans and the Russians meet. And then in April of 1930, Berlin falls and Hitler kills himself before being taken prisoner by the Russians. On May 7th, the Germans are going to surrender. And May 8th, 1945, the war in Europe is over, and that's going to be referred to as Victory in Europe Day in the United States. And I think that's a good place to stop today. We'll finish up Japan tomorrow and move on from there. So does anybody have any questions?
I don't.
Okay.
No.
Okay, sounds good. So all right, I'm gonna let you guys go. I would ask you to watch the videos if you haven't, and we'll just get back together tomorrow. So I will see you then.
Okay, thank you.
Very
Bye-bye.
insightful.